Hey guys, tonight we step onto the Giza plateau the way you do when you can't sleep and your brain decides it wants to time travel instead of resting. The air is cool. The sand is a soft hush under your shoes, and the pyramids stand out against the night like giant dark ships run aground on a sea that used to be a river of stars. You're close enough to feel the scale, not just see it. The stone looks calm, like it has all the time in the world, because honestly, it kind of does. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid and its neighbours were built in Egypt's Old Kingdom during the 4th dynasty in a world of kings, priests, and a state that could feed thousands of workers. But historians still argue whether every part of how it was done is fully understood, and that's where tonight gets interesting. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and we're not proving anything tonight. We're following clues. You'll probably hear a few what-if questions that float like dust in lamplight and then settle back down. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love picturing this as one big sleepy campfire scattered across time zones. Also, small reality check, you probably won't survive this as a weekend DIY project. Even with a YouTube tutorial, even with 2 snacks and a motivational playlist. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing where the desert holds its breath. The night wind slides across the plateau and makes a sound like a distant brush sweeping stone. You look up and the pyramids are not just monuments here, they are presence. The lines climb step by step toward the sky, and the edges catch what little light there is, as if the stones are remembering the sun. What's broadly accepted is that Giza is an Old Kingdom project engineered under royal authority, fueled by agriculture along the Nile, and built by human hands, human backs, and human planning. Archaeology suggests that Egypt at this time had a centralized state, capable of organizing labor, collecting grain, and sending teams to quarry, haul shape, and set stone. Most historians agree that this is not a story of mysterious, non-human builders. It is a story of people, very stubborn people. The kind of people who see a giant rock and think, yes, we will move that, and then we will move 10,000 more. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Even if you accept the mainstream timeline, you're still left with questions that feel oddly human, not cosmic, not magical, practical. How did they keep the lines so straight? How did they coordinate so many tasks without modern cranes, without steel, without engines? How did they align so precisely that you can stand here thousands of years later and still feel the geometry holding steady? One interpretation is that the pyramids were not created out of a sudden burst of genius that appeared from nowhere. A careful reading might suggest they represent a long chain of learning. The Egyptians of the Old Kingdom did not wake up one morning and invent everything. They inherited habits, refined them, argued about them, improved them, and sometimes improvise when things didn't go as planned. That is how real building happens. That is how every big human project works, whether it's a pyramid or a highway that somehow takes 6 years to finish, even though the sign promised 18 months. You let your eyes travel across the plateau and you notice how the landscape itself feels like part of the construction. The rock under your feet is not just ground, it's a foundation. The builders chose a place where stone was already close, where the bedrock could support weight, where the plateau rises above the floodplain. The evidence we do have points to careful site selection. It's possible that the landscape did half the work by being naturally suited to monumental building. And now comes the part where the mind starts to wander gently, safely, like a slow boat drifting away from shore. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what if some of the knowledge that made this project feasible existed here in simpler form before Egypt looked like Egypt? Not a lost laser civilization, not flying machines, not anything you'd have to whisper about like it's forbidden. Just earlier communities, older routines, people who understood stone and measurement in ways that don't always leave neat inscriptions. Most historians agree that Egypt as a recognizable state formed over time, especially as communities along the Nile became more organized and unified. Archaeology suggests that before the dynasties, there were pre-dynastic cultures, building settlements, shaping pottery, burying their dead, with care trading, experimenting with symbols. The evidence we do have points to gradual development, not a sudden pop into existence. But historians still argue whether the earliest steps of that development are fully visible to us, because the Nile shifts the desert to berries, and time is a very tidy librarian that loves misplacing the first chapter of every story. You walk slowly because this is not a sprint, it's bedtime history. Your pace is the pace of someone trying not to wake up their own thoughts too sharply. The wind brushes your face, cool and dry, and you can smell dust, faint minerals, something like warm stone that has been holding yesterday's heat. You pause and look at the Great Pyramid again. From here, it doesn't feel like a single object. It feels like a frozen process, like you can almost see the steps of work still stacked in place. The blocks are not all identical, and that matters. The evidence we do have points to variation in stone size and quality depending on location and purpose. Some blocks are rougher, some are fitted with more care. That suggests a building strategy, a kind of logic. Save the finest work for the places that will be seen and use what's adequate where it will be hidden. Even modern humans do this. You buy the nice pillows for the couch and then the cheap ones for the guest room. You pretend you're going to decorate next month. Most historians agree that the pyramid was once covered in casing stones, smoother and brighter, making the whole structure gleam in the sun. At night, you have to imagine it. A smooth white mountain, catching moonlight, reflecting starlight, standing like a polished thought against the dark. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination, but the idea of the casing is solid enough that you can let your mind picture it without falling into fantasy. Now let's step carefully into the before Egypt feeling, because this is where people can get tempted to run too fast. A fringe idea proposes that Giza was built by a civilization that existed long before dynastic Egypt, a forgotten advanced society that handed down technology and vanished. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it keeps appearing in books and documentaries because it scratches an itch. It's a clean story. It feels dramatic. It offers a hidden truth. But we're not doing hidden truths tonight. To be clear, this is debated, and the evidence for a separate advanced pre-Egyptian builder civilization is thin. A more cautious explanation could be that what existed before Egypt was not a different species of builder, but earlier phases of the same human story. People in the Nile Valley and nearby regions who learned to organize labor, shape stone track seasons, and build big things with small tools. Over generations, skills accumulate, methods mature, a kingdom forms, and then a king like Khufu or the state around him can call on a deep reservoir of practical knowledge. One interpretation is that monuments like this are less about a single brilliant moment and more about institutional memory. The skill of quarrying is learned, the skill of hauling is learned, the skill of measuring and levelling is learned, the rhythm of feeding workers is learned, even the ability to keep people motivated for years is learned, which is honestly the hardest engineering problem in history. You could have the best plan in the world, but if everyone decides to go home, you're just standing in the desert with a pile of rocks and big dreams. You let yourself imagine the plateau not as a finished site, but as a place full of movement. Not spooky movement, just human movement. Lines of workers, teams calling out in cadence, sledges scraping, dust rising, the smell of sweat, bread, beer, stone powder, the soft thump of tools, the sound of someone laughing at a bad joke, because even in ancient times, somebody's always trying to be funny on the job site. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the True Builders is not a secret group hidden in shadows, but the countless ordinary people whose names never made it into royal inscriptions? Most historians agree the kings claimed the glory, but archaeology suggests the labour force was large and organised. The evidence we do have points to human lives woven into this stone, and the mystery isn't that they existed, it's that we can't meet them properly. We can't shake their hands. We can't hear their voices. We can only infer their world from what remains. Historians still argue whether the building process relied primarily on one grand method like a single massive ramp, or a combination of strategies that shifted as the pyramid rose. That debate matters because it shows something important. Even in mainstream history, there are open questions. You can stand on solid ground and still admit uncertainty. That is not weakness. That is honesty. That is how careful thinking works. And now as you walk a little farther along the edge of the plateau, the wind changes slightly. It brings a faint scent from the lower land, like damp earth that isn't visible from up here. You can almost sense the Nile in the darkness, not right beside you, but near enough that life could flow to this place. The river is the quiet partner in this story. It feeds the fields, it times the seasons, it carries stone and people. The evidence we do have points to the Nile as the backbone of Old Kingdom logistics. It's possible too that the Nile was the backbone long before kings wore crowns. Before Egypt had a name that sounded like a nation, the river still ran. People still gathered. People still learned what floods meant. People still noticed the sky. They still counted days. They still watched where the sun rose. The desert kept its secrets, and the river kept its routine. You stop again, and in the silence, the pyramids seem even larger. The night makes everything feel more intimate and more endless at the same time. You hear your own breath, you hear the faint whisper of sand moving, and you feel the shape of the question we're holding tonight. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. And as you stand here with stone and starlight, and a cool wind brushing your face, you let one calm possibility settle in your mind. What if the civilization before Egypt is not a separate lost world, but the early quieter chapters of the same human story? Not glamorous, not supernatural, just old, older than the names, older than the kings, a long apprenticeship in how to build, how to measure, how to organize, and how to believe in something large enough that you're willing to move mountains one block at a time. You start walking again, and the night seems to widen as if the plateau itself is giving you more room to think. The stones underfoot are uneven, not in a dramatic way, just in the honest way. Old ground becomes when millions of feet and centuries of wind have had their turn. Your shoes scuff sand, and you feel that soft grit work its way into every tiny seam, like the desert is quietly signing its name on you. If you ever wondered what souvenir means in a place like this, it's basically sand in your socks forever. Most historians agree that the pyramids at Giza weren't built by a handful of geniuses in isolation, but by a large, organised workforce supported by a functioning state. Archaeology suggests there were worker settlements and infrastructure designed to feed and house people close to the building site. The evidence we do have points to planning on a scale that feels almost modern, supplies coming in, meals prepared in bulk, tools maintained, teams rotated, schedules tracked. It's not just stone, it's systems. And yet, historians still argue whether the labour force was made up primarily of seasonal workers doing state service full-time specialist crews, or some blend that changed as the building demands shifted. The debate matters because it changes the emotional temperature of the story. Different models paint different pictures of daily life. If the workforce is seasonal, you imagine waves of farmers arriving when fields are flooded and farming pauses. If it's mostly full-time crews, you imagine a more specialised culture of builders, people who know stone the way a musician knows scales. One interpretation is that the reality was flexible. A careful reading might suggest a layered labour system. Some specialists who stay year-round and keep the technical knowledge steady, and some rotating labour that brings muscle and manpower when the calendar allows. A more cautious explanation could be that we're trying to force a neat modern category onto an ancient world that didn't label itself the way we do. People were probably just people doing what the season and the state demanded and trying to go home with enough food and dignity to keep living. You keep moving and your imagination does that sleepy trick, where it fills in missing scenes like a slow, gentle film. You picture a settlement near the plateau, not glamorous, not mystical, just practical. Low buildings, courtyards, storage spaces, fires at dawn, the smell of bread baking, because bread is basically the original universal currency of comfort. You can almost hear the sound of grinding grain, that steady rasp that becomes a kind of music when you do it every day. If you listen too long, you might accidentally relax, which is kind of the point. What's broadly accepted is that workers needed food, and lots of it. Archaeology suggests large-scale food production and distribution supported major projects including baking and butchery. The evidence we do have points to an economy capable of turning harvest into labour. Grain becomes bread. Bread becomes energy. Energy becomes stone moved into place. It's a simple chain, but it's also the secret engine of the ancient world. And here's where the civilization before Egypt idea can be handled carefully, like carrying a bowl of water without spilling. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it's possible that the skills needed to feed and manage large groups didn't appear overnight with a king's decree. One interpretation is that earlier communities along the Nile developed traditions of cooperation and distribution long before pyramids existed. You can imagine villages learning how to store grain, how to share in lean years, how to organize labour for canals or flood control, not because they planned for pyramids, but because they needed to survive. Most historians agree that pre-dynastic and early dynastic communities were already building, trading, and organising themselves in ways that laid groundwork for later state projects. The evidence we do have points to gradual growth, and historians still argue whether the earliest stages of that growth are fully visible to us, because so much of ordinary life leaves soft traces that time can erase. Pots break and get buried. Mud brick crumbles. Wooden tools rot. The river shifts. The desert drifts. And suddenly you have a gap that feels like a missing staircase. A fringe idea proposes that an older, vanished civilization taught Egypt advanced construction and then disappeared. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it floats around because it's emotionally satisfying. It gives you a single dramatic answer. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the honest version of this story tends to be messier. A more cautious explanation could be that there wasn't a single teacher civilization. There were many small teachers, generations of trial and error, the slow passing of craft knowledge from hand to hand, the quiet refinement of organization, and the human habit of learning by watching. You wander close enough to imagine a worker's morning. You're not a king. You're not a priest. You're someone with tired shoulders and a job that starts before the sun is fully awake. You step out into cool air. You smell ash from last night's fire. Someone hands you bread. Someone else hands you beer, which in this context is basically liquid calories and hydration, not a party. You take a sip and think, okay, this is going to be a long day. And it is. It always is. Archaeology suggests teams may have been organised into groups with identities, perhaps crews that took pride in their work. The evidence we do have points to social organisation beyond pure force. One interpretation is that pride and belonging helped keep people moving forward. You can picture a foreman calling out a team name, not to intimidate but to rally. You can picture jokes teasing small competitions. The ancient equivalent of our crew is faster than yours, followed by exactly the kind of trash talk you hear on any job site today. Humans are remarkably consistent in that way. Here's joke number 1 for the night. If you think your workplace group chat is chaotic, imagine trying to coordinate 1,000 people without a single quick call option. No calendars, no pings, just yelling hand signals, and the hope that the guy carrying the water jars doesn't wander off to look at a cool rock. You keep moving, and the plateau breeze picks up, brushing your ears, making the night feel a little sharper. You think about how a massive project isn't only stone and labour, it's also recovery, it's sleep, it's injuries that need rest, it's tools that need repair, it's food that needs to be cooked. Someone's always doing the unglamorous work that keeps the glamorous work possible. Most historians agree that large-scale construction required support roles: bakers, brewers, doctors or healers, toolmakers, overseers, transport coordinators. The evidence we do have points to a whole ecosystem of labour. And the more you picture it, the more the pyramid stops feeling like a single object and starts feeling like a city of tasks stacked into a triangle. Historians still argue whether the workers were treated primarily as conscripted labour-paid labour, or some combination shaped by status and obligation. To be clear, this is debated. The old caricature of endless enslaved masses doesn't fit neatly with much of what mainstream archaeology suggests about organised settlements and provisioning, but the ancient world still had hierarchy, pressure and hardship. A careful reading might suggest a complex reality. People could be both proud and exhausted, both valued and controlled, both fed and compelled. Human societies are rarely clean stories. Now, as your walk continues, you feel the night wind tug at your shirt like a quiet reminder that this is a desert plateau, not a museum exhibit. You're not looking at a finished wonder so much as a place where ordinary routines were scaled up to an almost absurd level. And that brings you back to the theme, the true builders. What's broadly accepted is that dynastic Egypt built Giza, but if you widen the frame, one interpretation is that the true builders include generations before the pyramids, people who learned how to store grain, manage floods, organise labour, and pass down craft knowledge. And then gently the imagination opens a door without claiming it's the only exit. What if in the quiet years before kings carved their names into stone, there were communities along the river who practiced the basics of monumental thinking in smaller ways? Not pyramids, but canals, embankments, communal storehouses, ritual spaces. What if the plateau wind you hear tonight once carried the smoke of their fires too? Not as proof, not as certainty, just as a possibility. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Joke number 2. You know you're in deep history mode. when grain storage management starts sounding like an action movie. Coming this summer, The Accountant of the Nile. He balances the books, and the entire kingdom survives. Thrilling. You pause again, and you let the sound of the wind fill the space where certainty usually lives. The pyramids don't need a secret civilization to be extraordinary. They need people. They need bread. They need a village that wakes up early and works late and keeps doing it. The evidence we do have points to that kind of world. And the mystery, the soft mist, is simply the parts we can't fully confirm how much of this skill was invented here, and how much was inherited from quieter centuries that left fewer words behind. You drift farther across the plateau until the stone under your feet feels less like a monument and more like a workshop floor after everyone has gone home. The night air cools the rock, and the rock cools your thoughts. Somewhere out in the darkness, the desert makes that dry brushing sound again, like a giant hand smoothing a blanket. Now your mind starts to lean into the most stubborn character in this whole story, and it is not a king or a priest. It is gravity. Gravity is always on duty. Gravity never takes a holiday. Gravity is the one co-worker who shows up early, stays late, and still acts like you are the one slacking. Most historians agree that the primary building materials at Giza were limestone with finer casing, limestone once used on the outside, and granite used in key interior areas. Archaeology suggests large quarries were worked with stone, extracted, shaped, moved and set, in a process that had to be repeated thousands of times. The evidence we do have points to a deeply physical reality. No matter how elegant the plan, each block begins as a chunk of earth you have to convince to change its address. You imagine the quarries, not the romantic kind with dramatic lighting and a single worker in silhouette, but the real kind with noise and grit and crowds. Stone dust in the air, the scrape of copper tools, the dull percussion of pounders, voices calling not poetically but practically, because somebody has to say move that and somebody has to say not on my foot. One interpretation is that quarrying itself was a specialized craft, with people who understood stone the way a baker understands dough. A careful reading might suggest they knew where limestone would split cleanly, how to chase a line, how to wedge and pry, how to avoid wasting effort. And when you are trying to build something, that huge wasted effort is the one luxury you cannot afford. Joke number 1, softly delivered. If you think you have had a hard day, picture yourself arguing with a boulder that refuses to just scoot a little. The boulder does not care about your schedule. The boulder does not care about your feelings. The boulder is living its best life. The evidence we do have points to transport as the next challenge. Moving stone is not one problem, it is a chain of problems. Getting it out of the quarry, getting it onto a sled or platform, getting it across ground that fights back, getting it up or down or around corners, and then getting it into place with enough precision that the pyramid stays stable for thousands of years and does not develop an embarrassing lean. Archaeology suggests sledges were used and that teams could haul heavy loads with ropes leverage and coordinated pulling. There are later Egyptian depictions that show people pulling a large statue on a sledge while water is poured in front, which suggests one practical trick. Dampening sand can reduce friction. To be clear, the depiction is from a later period than the Old Kingdom, so you treat it as suggestive, not conclusive. Still, it raises the possibility that simple physics tricks were part of the ancient toolkit. You can almost see it. A line of people leaning into ropes, feet digging, hands blistering, someone calling a rhythm, so the pull is steady instead of chaotic. A splash of water darkening sand into a firmer path, and every few minutes somebody has to stop and rewrap their hands because rope does not care about your skin either. Most historians agree that builders also relied on levers and wooden rollers or timbers in certain contexts, although the exact mix of methods is debated. The evidence we do have points to a mindset of constant adjustment. You do not need one perfect method. You need methods that work today on this slope, with this weight in this weather, with this crew. That takes you right into the famous argument that never really goes out of style, even after thousands of years. How do you raise stone that high? Historians still argue whether a single massive ramp did most of the work, or whether ramps were built in stages, or whether a combination of straight ramps, zigzag ramps, and spiral ramps were used depending on height and space. Some proposals focus on a long ramp extending outward. Others suggest ramps hugging the structure. Others imagine internal passages used for hauling in certain phases. The debate is lively because the pyramid is so big that almost any plausible method becomes a huge engineering project on its own. One interpretation is that the answer is not one ramp, but many ramps. A careful reading might suggest a flexible system that changed as the pyramid rose. Early stages could allow broad, straightforward access. Higher stages might require tighter paths or more clever routing. And even if you had the world's best ramp design, you still have to build and maintain the ramp itself. So you end up building a giant structure, while also building the giant structure that helps you build the giant structure. Humans are nothing if not committed to complications. Joke number 2. This is basically the ancient version of buying a special tool organizer so you can find the tool you bought to organize your tools. The organizer becomes its own project. Suddenly your weekend is gone. Except here, your weekend is about 20 years, and instead of a tool organizer, you have a ramp the size of a neighborhood. What's broadly accepted is that Old Kingdom Egypt had the administrative capacity to coordinate labor and materials. Archaeology suggests planning went beyond brute force. The evidence we do have points to measurement and control. To set stones accurately, you need lines, levels, and reference points. It's possible that they used simple but effective surveying tools like plumb bobs, sighting rods, and levelling techniques to keep courses even. You walk slowly in your mind through the step-by-step process. A block arrives, it is nudged into place, it is checked against a line, it is tapped, levered, adjusted. A thin layer of mortar may help bedding and levelling in places, though the fit of many stones is still impressive. This is not chaos, this is repetition patience, and the kind of quiet precision that does not look dramatic on camera but builds the world. Now the misty part comes back carefully labelled and kept gentle. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what if some of the techniques that made this feasible were inherited from older desert experience that did not leave clear monuments? Not a separate advanced civilization with impossible technology, but a chain of craft knowledge passed through generations that predate the dynasties. A more cautious explanation could be that ordinary practice like quarrying, hauling, and building in stone were refined across centuries of smaller projects. People learn, they standardize, they teach apprentices, and by the time a king demands a pyramid, the knowledge feels new only because it is now being applied at a scale that shocks you. A fringe idea proposes that there was a specific lost group of master builders who arrived with secret methods and then vanished. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for a distinct pre-Egyptian builder culture at Giza is thin. Still, the popularity of the idea tells you something about the human brain. We like single explanations. We like the feeling of a hidden key. But the mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and the real story might be more ordinary and more impressive at the same time. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that people moved stone with planning. The interpreted part is how they combined methods. The imagined part is the feeling of being one of them, standing in the dust, staring up at a slope of stone and thinking, okay, we do it again. Joke number 3, if you ever complain about taking the stairs, imagine your stairwell is made of limestone blocks and your boss says, carry this. Suddenly your fitness tracker resigns. You let the night wind cool the scene. You picture the ramp, whatever its shape, not as a magical secret, but as a temporary scar of earth and stone. You picture the sledges scraping. You picture the ropes tightening. You picture the foreman squinting at a line and saying, not yet a little more, and the crew groaning like every human crew that has ever heard a little more. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid's success lies not in one miracle trick, but in the accumulation of workable solutions. Archaeology suggests a mix of organisation-skilled labour, material, access and time. The evidence we do have points to human persistence. And then softly you allow one last what if to settle without claiming it as fact. What if the true machine was not wood or rope or ramp, but a tradition of technique passed down from earlier communities who learned to coke heavy things across stubborn ground? What if the plateau holds not a secret civilization, but a long memory of people getting better at the same hard task year after year, until impossible becomes simply scheduled? You let your attention drift from the stone itself to the quieter thing that makes stone obey. Not muscle, not even technique. It is paperwork, or whatever the ancient version of paperwork feels like, when it is scratched into clay, inked onto surfaces that do not always survive, and carried by a runner who is hoping his boss does not ask for one more copy. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid is associated with Pharaoh Khufu of the 4th dynasty, and that royal authority shaped the project's scale and purpose. The evidence we do have points to a state that could command resources, organise labour, and keep the work moving for years. You can feel that authority even at night, because a monument this large is basically a message written in stone. Somebody had the power to tell thousands of people what to do tomorrow. Archaeology suggests that administration mattered as much as quarrying. Grain has to be counted, tools have to be issued, work crews have to be assigned, injuries have to be handled, stone deliveries have to arrive in an order that makes sense. If you miss a step, the whole process becomes a very expensive pile of confusion. You can picture it as a huge living chart, even if nobody calls it that, with tasks flowing into tasks, like a river splitting into channels. You stand still, listening to the wind, and you imagine the human layer beneath the stones. Someone wakes up early not to pull a rope, but to count loaves. Someone else checks the storage marks a tally and mutters a complaint about how people keep borrowing supplies without signing for them. Joke number one gently: the first real pyramid may have been built out of stone. But the first real stress headache was built out of inventory management. What's broadly accepted is that the Old Kingdom developed strong systems of control and coordination. One interpretation is that bureaucracy is the pyramid's hidden scaffolding, the invisible structure that keeps everything else from collapsing into chaos. You do not see the lists and schedules when you look at the pyramid. You see the result. But the result suggests there were planners somewhere who understood that big dreams require small numbers added up correctly. Historians still argue whether the administrative system for Giza was centrally managed in every detail, or whether crews and local supervisors had more autonomy than we usually imagine. That debate matters because it changes the feel of the work. If everything is directed from the top, you picture strict oversight and constant reporting. If there is more local control, you picture foremen making decisions on the ground, adjusting plans when reality refuses to cooperate. A careful reading might suggest it was both a strong central framework with a lot of practical improvisation inside it, because no plan survives contact with a stubborn block of limestone. You keep your mind on Khufu for a moment, not as a distant name, but as a symbol of the state's ability to mobilize. Most historians agree that kingship in this period was tightly linked to religion and cosmic order. The pyramid is not only a tomb, it is also a statement that the world is organized, that the king sits at the center of that organization, and that the state can turn belief into architecture. The evidence we do have points to this blend of sacred purpose and practical management. Now you let your thoughts slide toward writing itself, because writing is one of the most powerful tools in any construction project. Not because it lifts stone, but because it lifts memory. Writing holds instructions steady. It lets you send decisions across distance. It lets you tell someone what to do tomorrow without having to personally stand there and point. Archaeology suggests that Egyptian record keeping grew in complexity over time, tied to administration and resource control. That is the mainstream anchor solid enough to rest your head on. One interpretation is the act of building the pyramid is also an act of building an information system. You can picture scribes tracking supplies, recording labour groups, noting deliveries, not because they love paperwork, but because the whole machine breaks without it. And scribes become the quiet engineers of the kingdom, keeping order with ink, while others keep order with rope. Joke number 2. If you have ever tried to keep track of receipts for taxes, you already understand ancient Egypt's true superpower. You think the pyramid is impressive until you realise somebody had to file stone shipment number 4812 and then not lose it. The mystery part enters softly here and it stays inside the safety rail. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that administration existed and mattered. The interpretation is how it functioned day to day at Giza. The imagined part is what it feels like to be a scribe in the dust, sitting cross-legged with a writing kit while the desert wind tries to redecorate your work with sand. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what if some scribal habits, some routines of counting and recording were inherited from earlier Nile communities whose traces are harder to see? Not a secret empire with glowing tablets and impossible libraries, just older practices of keeping track. A more cautious explanation could be that early record keeping grew naturally from trade and agriculture, especially in a landscape where timing and storage can decide whether people eat. Still, a fringe idea proposes that Egyptian writing and administration were borrowed from an earlier, now lost culture that had already developed advanced record systems. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for a distinct prior civilization handing down a complete bureaucratic package is thin, but it can be treated as a question rather than a conclusion. If early communities experimented with symbols and counting long before dynastic Egypt, then later systems might reflect not a single invention, but a long evolution that includes influences we cannot neatly label. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Writing materials decay. Records are selective. Most lists, if they survive at all, survive by accident. And even when something survives, it might not tell you what you want to know. It might tell you the number of cattle, but not the mood of the people. It might record the grain allotment, but not the joke someone told while eating. You imagine the workers lining up for rations, not as a faceless crowd, but as individuals. Bread in hand, a sip of beer, a moment of relief, then back to the work. The evidence we do have points to a system of provisioning that kept bodies fueled. One interpretation is that the state bought loyalty and stability through food, turning harvest into social glue. And what if the earliest lessons of that system were learned long before kings wore grand titles, when villages discovered that survival depends on shared storage and shared rules? Now you think about how Khufu's name becomes attached to the pyramid. Most historians agree that royal monuments tend to carry royal credit. That is not unique to Egypt. Powerful people put their names on big projects. The evidence we do have points to a culture where kingship is central and where monuments reinforce that centrality. But a careful reading might suggest that the real builders include countless people whose names never appear in grand inscriptions because the system is not designed to celebrate them. Joke number 3, if you ever feel annoyed that your workplace project got credited to the team, instead of you personally, just remember that at least your boss is not a pharaoh. The performance review in ancient Egypt is probably less growth mindset and more eternal monument. You breathe in and the night air feels clean and dry. The wind keeps moving steady like a fan you might turn on at home to make sleep easier, and you let that steadiness match the idea of administration. Steady, repetitive, necessary, 1,000 tiny decisions that create one enormous outcome. And then just before your thoughts get too sharp, you soften them again. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. Most historians agree Khufu's era had the authority to build at Giza. Archaeology suggests organisation and record-keeping made that possible. One interpretation is that bureaucracy, not mystery, is the true hidden scaffolding. And if you allow yourself one calm, cinematic, what if it is this? What if the quiet art of counting and recording learned in earlier centuries along the Nile is the oldest tool in the whole project, whispering through time under the sound of wind across stone? You keep moving through the cool dark and the plateau feels less like a single place and more like a giant measuring board laid flat beneath the sky. The wind keeps brushing across stone, steady and dry, like the world is quietly exhaling. You look up and the stars are sharp enough to feel close, even though they are not. Up here, with the city noise far away, the sky becomes the oldest ceiling you have ever stood under. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid's alignment is remarkably accurate, especially in how closely it faces true north. Archaeology suggests that ancient Egyptian builders had practical surveying skills, and the evidence we do have points to careful measurement, not lucky guessing. That alone is enough to make you pause, because it means the project begins long before the first block is hauled. It begins with lines drawn on ground that wants to erase them. You imagine the first steps as quiet and almost gentle. People with ropes, people with pegs, people with straight sticks, plumb bobs and eyes trained to notice when something is even slightly off. A line gets stretched, a peg gets tapped in, a mark gets made, then checked again, because in big building the difference between close enough and perfect is the difference between a monument and a problem. One interpretation is that the greatest technology here is not a device, but a habit of precision. A careful reading might suggest that the builders treat measurement like a ritual, not because it is mystical, but because it is serious. If your base is wrong by a little, your top is wrong by a lot. That is just geometry doing its quiet work. Joke number 1. Soft and familiar. If you have ever tried to hang a picture frame and ended up with it leaning in a way you cannot unsee, you already understand the emotional trauma of alignment. Now imagine your picture frame is a pyramid and you cannot just tilt it and pretend it is artistic. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Egyptian surveyors likely used straightforward methods to establish right angles and level surfaces. The evidence we do have points to practical techniques like using stretched cords to form triangles, using plumb lines to check verticality, and using levelling methods that could involve water. Archaeology suggests that levelling can be done with simple tools like channels or basins where water naturally finds a flat plane. You do not need lasers to get a level. You need patience and a willingness to stare at water until it stops moving. The night wind cools your face and you picture a shallow trench filled with water, or a set of water references used to check the ground. The exact method is debated, but the principle is clear. Water does not lie about level. It is the most honest engineer in the room. Then you return to the question that makes people's eyebrows rise. How do you find true north without a compass? Most historians agree that the Egyptians could use the sky to orient structures, and archaeology suggests they paid close attention to celestial patterns. One interpretation is that they used circumpolar stars, those that never set, rotating around the north celestial pole. A careful reading might suggest a method where surveyors observe pairs of stars as they cross a vertical line, using that moment to define a north-south axis. The details can be tricky, and scholars debate which specific stars might have been used at different times, but the general idea rests on something simple. The sky provides a reference frame if you are willing to watch it carefully. Historians still argue whether the primary alignment method relied on observing certain stars, observing the sun's shadow, or combining both with repeated checks over multiple nights. That debate is part of what makes this story feel alive. It is not that historians have no idea, it is that there are multiple plausible methods, and the evidence does not always preserve the step-by-step instructions. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. You stand and look up again. The stars do not feel romantic right now. They feel practical, like a grid. You imagine a surveyor watching the same patch of sky for hours, waiting for a moment when 2 points line up. No talking, minimal movement, just attention, then a quick signal, a mark on the ground, a rope aligned, a quiet satisfaction. Joke number 2. You think you spend a lot of time staring at your phone, but these people stare at the sky so hard they basically invent focus. And they do it without an app that says north is that way, which is honestly unfair. Archaeology suggests standardized units of measurement existed, and most historians agree that the Egyptians used forms of the cubit as a measuring system. The evidence we do have points to careful, repeatable measurement, not improvisation. One interpretation is that standard measuring tools like marked rods helped keep work consistent across teams. That matters because consistency is how you turn thousands of small actions into one coherent shape. Now the misty part arrives gently and stays labelled. A popular rumour claims that the pyramids are aligned to secret cosmic codes, or that their layout mirrors star patterns in a way that reveals an advanced hidden plan. One of the most common versions is the idea that the 3 pyramids match the belt of Orion. This theory isn't widely accepted as a definitive blueprint, but it keeps returning because it is easy to picture and emotionally satisfying. To be clear, this is debated. Some scholars see alignments as symbolic or coincidental, while others argue for intentional relationships between monuments and sky law. The evidence is suggestive in places, not conclusive. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient Egyptians cared deeply about the sky in religious and practical ways, so celestial symbolism might show up without requiring a perfect one-to-one map. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can hold a calm what if without claiming you solved anything. What if some choices were both practical and symbolic? What if surveying for north also felt like aligning the king's world with a cosmic order people believed in? That is a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the pyramid's orientation is precise, and the Egyptians had surveying knowledge. The interpretation is which exact celestial technique they favoured. The imagined part is you standing among them at night, feeling the cold air, hearing the wind, watching a star drift into position like a slow clock hand. You picture the tools again. Ropes, pegs, plumb bobs, a sighting tool held steady, maybe a simple frame that helps define vertical, maybe a cord stretched tight, maybe a shadow line checked at sunrise. Archaeology suggests such tools are plausible, and the evidence we do have points to a world where skill can be embedded in ordinary objects. Joke number 3, the ancient surveyor is basically the original friend who insists on walking straight in a parking lot. Everyone else is wandering, and he is like, "No, we are going precisely north," and somehow he is right. Then your thoughts drift back to the idea of before Egypt in a way that stays mainstream first. Most historians agree that dynastic Egypt inherited and refined practices from earlier Nile communities. Archaeology suggests continuity in settlement and culture over long periods. One interpretation is that the sky-watching habit could be older than the king's because farming itself demands attention to seasons, floods and cycles. You do not need a pyramid to care about the sun. You need crops. And now the cinematic question kept soft and safe. What if the sky was the first classroom long before the state became a state, and long before Giza rose from bedrock? What if earlier communities taught their children to notice patterns, to track time, to respect measurement, because survival depends on it? Then when the old kingdom organises a project like this, the skill is not invented from nothing. It is gathered from a long human habit of watching, marking and remembering. You keep walking and the stars keep turning slowly above you. The wind continues its steady hush. The pyramid remains still, but your mind can feel the invisible lines that shape it, lines pulled from the sky down to the ground, held in place by rope, patience, and the quiet stubbornness of people who refuse to let the world be crooked. You keep wandering until the stone feels close enough to read with your fingertips, not with your eyes. The night air makes the surface cool and slightly slick in places, and when you brush your hand along a block, you can feel tiny ridges and shallow scars. Not dramatic gouges, just the kind of quiet evidence that tells you somebody worked here with a real tool for a long time, with a lot of patience and probably a lot of sighing. Most historians agree that Old Kingdom builders used copper tools for many tasks along with stone tools and wooden implements, and that they understood how to get useful work from materials that look unimpressive to modern eyes. Archaeology suggests copper chisels, copper saws, wooden mallets, stone pounders, ropes, levers, and abrasive sand were part of the practical toolkit. The evidence we do have points to a world where technology is not a single shiny object, but a set of techniques. And technique is the key word here. Copper is not steel. Copper is soft compared to the stone you see all around you. That fact can make people blink and immediately reach for something mysterious. But a more cautious explanation could be that the builders did not try to bully the stone with raw hardness. They persuaded it with method. You can cut stone not only by making the tool harder than the stone, but by using abrasives, repeated motion-controlled pressure and time. Time is the oldest tool on Earth, and it never breaks. One interpretation is that a copper saw is less like a modern saw that bites into wood and more like a frame that holds an edge while sand does the cutting. Sand becomes the teeth, the copper becomes the guide, the human becomes the motor. It's possible that this is one reason abrasive materials matter so much in ancient stonework, especially when you are aiming for flat surfaces and clean joins. Joke number 1. Sleep friendly if you ever used sandpaper and thought, why is this taking forever? Congratulations, you have touched the spirit of ancient engineering. Now imagine doing it on a block the size of a couch, and your boss calls it light sanding. You picture a workshop area near the quarries. Not a romantic workshop with one wise artisan in perfect lighting, but a busy place with noise grit and constant maintenance. Tools dull, edges bend, handles crack. Somebody is always fixing something. Archaeology suggests tool production and repair were ongoing needs, and the evidence we do have points to systems that supported that work. A project like Giza does not just consume stone. It consumes tools the way a campfire consumes wood. For limestone, copper chisels and adzes make more sense, especially for dressing surfaces and shaping blocks. For granite, the story changes. Granite is stubborn and coarse, and most historians agree that pounding stones, often made of harder rock like dolerite, were used to work it. Archaeology suggests these pounders exist at quarry sites, and the evidence we do have points to a very physical method, repeated pounding to crush and shape the surface, followed by smoothing and fitting. You can almost hear it even in the quiet night, the dull rhythm of stone on stone, a slow percussion that would carry across a work area like a heartbeat. Historians still argue whether the Egyptians relied more on chiselling, sawing with abrasives, or pounding in different contexts. That debate stays mainstream and practical. It is about which method dominates where. It is about how much was done at the quarry versus on site. It is about how standardized the workflow was. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, because many tools were made of materials that degrade, and many workspaces were temporary. The work happened, then the traces got swept away by time. You crouch in your mind and look closely at the notion of fit. The Great Pyramid blocks are not all perfectly tight in every location, and that itself is instructive. The evidence we do have points to different levels of finishing depending on the role of the block. Some are rougher where they are hidden. Some are more carefully dressed where precision matters. Most historians agree this reflects smart allocation of labour. You do not over-polish what no one will ever see. You save your energy for the joints that keep your structure stable and your faces aligned. Joke number 2. This is the ancient version of cleaning your house for guests. The living room looks amazing. The closet is a crime scene. Nobody opens the closet. Everyone survives. Now the before Egypt idea returns, but you keep it on a short leash, calm and honest. Most historians agree that the Nile Valley had long traditions of craft and material work before the Old Kingdom reached its peak. Archaeology suggests pre-dynastic communities made stone vessels, worked hard materials, and developed skilled hands. One interpretation is that the knowledge of abrasives grinding and patient shaping could have older roots than the dynasties passed down through apprenticeship rather than written manuals. It's possible that some of the most important methods were never recorded in detail because they were simply taught by doing. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the presence of tool marks, quarries, and plausible tool types. The interpretation is the exact workflow and how techniques varied by team and phase. The imagined part is you standing with a copper chisel in your hand, feeling it flex slightly, realizing you cannot force the stone, and then learning the slow trick of letting sand and repetition do the persuasion. A popular rumour claims that the builders used a lost chemical method to soften stone-making blocks easier to shape, almost like sculpting clay. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for widespread stone softening techniques is thin. Still, it shows up because it sounds like a neat shortcut. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, it remains more like a bedtime question than a historical statement. Could there have been occasional localized tricks with heat water or minerals that helped in specific situations? A more cautious explanation could be that the real softening was simply time planning and labour applied with good technique. Another fringe idea proposes that sound or vibration played a role, as if resonance could move or shape stone. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it leans more into modern imagination than into strong archaeological support. To be clear, this is debated, and the evidence we do have points far more strongly toward practical tools, ramps, abrasives, and human organisation. Still, you can hold the mood of the question without treating it as fact. What if the legends and rumours are not literal instructions, but poetic ways people later try to describe astonishing labour? You let the plateau wind, calm your thoughts again. The simplest answer often feels less exciting, but it can be more respectful to the people who did the work. Archaeology suggests that skilled stoneworking is possible with simple materials when the technique is refined, and the evidence we do have points to a culture capable of patient precision. You imagine a worker learning the craft. The apprentice watches a master dress a block. The master does not lecture with big speeches. He shows angles. He shows pressure. He shows how to listen to the stone. The apprentice tries, fails, tries again. Eventually the block sits where it should, and the joint looks clean enough that the structure holds its shape. One interpretation is that this quiet teaching, repeated across generations, is the true technology behind monumental building. Joke number 3. The ancient training program is probably very short on motivational posters. No hang in there, kitten. Just a foreman staring at you like, make it flat. and you realise you have never truly understood the word flat until this moment. Most historians agree that when you add up these ordinary tools and extraordinary patience, you get something that can look impossible from a distance. And then gently, you allow one cinematic possibility to settle without claiming it as certainty. What if the most valuable thing the builders inherited from earlier centuries was not a secret device, but a mindset? A tradition of measured work, careful abrasion, and stubborn repetition carried from small workshops along the Nile into the largest project the kingdom could imagine. The stones do not need magic to become monumental. They need hands that know what they are doing and a culture that keeps teaching those hands how to get better. You let your feet carry you toward a quieter edge of the plateau in your imagination, where the stone under you feels like it is thinking about water. That sounds strange until you remember the Nile is the unseen partner in all of this. Even at night, even in the desert air, you can almost sense it in the way life gathers near a river and fades where the river cannot reach. Most historians agree that the Nile made large-scale building possible by feeding the population and moving people and materials. Archaeology suggests the river acted like a natural highway, especially during seasons when water levels made transport easier. The evidence we do have points to a logistical world, not only a construction site where timing and routing matter just as much as muscles. You picture a barge on dark water. The night is still, the river's surface is a slow mirror, and a load of stone sits low in the hull. It is not dramatic. It is work. Oars dip. A sail catches a soft wind. Someone calls to keep the boat aligned with the current, because a heavy load does not forgive sloppy steering. And you realise that before a block becomes part of a pyramid, it may spend time floating quietly, like a stubborn passenger being transported to a new life. One interpretation is that the Nile flood season was more than a natural event. A careful reading might suggest it was treated like a calendar for the whole kingdom. When fields are under water, farming slows. When farming slows, labour and time shift. It's possible that this is when the state could mobilise more people for big projects, not because everyone is thrilled about it, but because the seasonal rhythm creates an opening. The evidence we do have points to a society that lives by water, and water sets the tempo. You imagine the practical side of that rhythm. Grain goes into storage. People rotate into different duties. Boats become more active. Materials move. The river does not only carry stone, it carries food, tools, wood rope, and the quiet confidence of a plan that assumes the river will do what it usually does. Joke number 1, gentle and sleepy. You know you are in ancient Egypt when your entire project timeline depends on the river's mood. Modern people complain about traffic. Ancient builders complain about water levels. Same energy, different century. Archaeology suggests there are ways to connect the plateau to the river, possibly through canals, basins or harbour, like areas used for unloading. The evidence we do have points to deliberate infrastructure. You do not want to drag heavy stone for miles over rough ground if you can bring it closer by water first. Most historians agree that moving supplies efficiently would be essential. That includes not only the big glamorous blocks, but the endless small things that keep work going. You picture the moment of arrival. The barge noses into a landing area. Workers step into shallow water. Ropes get thrown and caught. The load is secured. The block is shifted, coaxed onto a sled, and suddenly the river part of its journey is over. Now it belongs to the dust and the pull of ropes again. The shift from water to land feels like a change in mood. Water is smooth cooperation. Land is stubborn negotiation. Historians still argue whether the most important stone transport routes relied on a direct canal approach to Giza temporary seasonal channels, or a combination that changed over time. That debate stays grounded in practical questions. Landscapes shift, rivers meander, human channels get dug and then fill in. What's broadly accepted is that water transport was likely used where it made sense, because it is efficient and because heavy loads like gentle movement more than jolting friction. You also begin to think about the boat pits at Giza because they feel like a doorway into a different kind of logistics. Archaeology suggests that boats were buried near the pyramids, and most historians agree these are connected to ritual and royal afterlife beliefs. The evidence we do have points to boats as meaningful objects, not just practical vehicles. In the Egyptian worldview, the king's journey can be imagined as a voyage, and boats fit naturally into that symbolism. One interpretation is that the presence of boats at Giza reflects a culture that thinks in river terms, even when standing on desert rock. You can almost feel the Nile in their imagination even here, and the cinematic part is easy to hold without claiming certainty. What if at night the builders looked down toward the river and felt that everything they were doing was a kind of journey too, from quarry to water to plateau to eternity? Now for a quirky tidbit that stays safely labelled. A popular rumour claims that some of the boat-related features at Giza suggest hidden waterways or secret underground channels that once ran beneath the plateau. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for a dramatic hidden river under the pyramids is thin. Still, it persists because the site feels like it should have deeper layers, and because humans love the idea that the ground is hiding an extra room. A more cautious explanation could be that the logistics relied on surface-level canals and basins that changed with seasons and time, leaving traces that are easy to misread if you want a secret badly enough. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the importance of the Nile and the evidence for boats and river transport culture. The interpretation is exactly how the unloading and routing systems worked in detail. The imagined part is you standing at a landing in the half-light, hearing water lap against wood while a block waits patiently to be dragged into history. You begin to see how the river turns a seemingly impossible project into a sequence of manageable steps. A block does not have to be moved from quarry to pyramid in one heroic effort. It can be moved in stages, quarry to river, river to landing, landing to ramp, ramp to placement. This is not magic. This is logistics. And logistics is what happens when humans get tired of suffering unnecessarily and decide to plan instead. Joke number 2, the ancient world invents the supply chain and immediately the supply chain invents headaches. Somewhere there is an overseer staring at a missing shipment thinking, we were supposed to have that limestone by Tuesday, even though Tuesday is not a thing yet. Most historians agree that large projects also require fuel beyond food. Wood for boats and sledges, rope fibres, perhaps imported timber for certain tasks. Archaeology suggests Egypt traded for resources it lacked in abundance, and the evidence we do have points to connections beyond one local quarry. That expands the picture. Giza is not only a site, it is a node in a network. Boats arrive, boats leave, goods move, information moves, people move. A monument rises because a whole landscape participates. One interpretation is that the Nile did not just move stone, it moved confidence. When a state can reliably gather grain schedule transport and coordinate deliveries, it can attempt bigger things. It's possible that the steady rhythm of the river encouraged a steady rhythm of ambition. Year after year, flood after flood, the kingdom learns that predictable cycles can support extraordinary plans. And now carefully, you let the before Egypt idea return in a way that stays grounded. Most historians agree that communities lived along the Nile for a very long time before the Grand Pyramids. Archaeology suggests people learned to navigate fish trade and travel on the river long before kings carved monuments. One interpretation is that river skill is an inherited craft passed down through generations who never dreamed of pyramids but understood currents, wind and timing. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine a chain of boat builders and river guides whose knowledge quietly set the stage for later monuments. Joke number 3. It is comforting to realise that even in deep antiquity, someone's job is basically make the boat stop leaking. That is a universal human experience. Different river, same panic. You breathe in the dry night air and let the thoughts settle. The Great Pyramid is stone, but it leans on water. The plateau feels distant from the river, yet the river's logic reaches up here like an invisible rope. The evidence we do have points to that partnership, and the mystery, the soft mist, is simply the details. We cannot fully confirm the exact shape of the canals, the exact route of every load, the way the schedule felt in someone's hands. What if the true builders of Giza include not only the stoneworkers on the plateau, but also the river people, the boat makers, the pilots, the loaders, the ones who understand water well enough to turn it into a moving road? Not a hidden civilization in the sensational sense, but a deep continuity of river knowledge that existed long before Egypt's most famous stones ever met the sky. You keep walking until the night feels almost ceremonial, like the air itself is trying not to disturb something important. The plateau is quiet, but it's not empty. It is full of intention. You can sense it in the way the monuments sit, where they sit, the way they face the sky, the way the ground around them is arranged like a stage built for a long performance that never truly ends. Most historians agree that the pyramids are tied to royal afterlife beliefs, and that the king's burial was meant to secure a kind of eternal continuation. Archaeology suggests the pyramid complex is more than a single pyramid. With temples, causeways and surrounding structures, that support ritual and remembrance. The evidence we do have points to a religious and political system fused together so tightly you can't pull them apart without breaking the picture. You stand in your mind where a causeway might once have guided processions, and you imagine the rhythm of ritual, not the loud kind, the steady kind, offerings carried, incense lifted, words spoken in careful order, priests moving as if the sequence matters as much as the meaning. The pyramid is the headline, but the daily work of keeping a king present in memory is the ongoing article that never stops being published. One interpretation is that the pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a machine for eternity built from stone belief and administration. That sounds mystical, but it's also practical. If a society believes the king's afterlife matters for cosmic order, then maintaining the king's cult becomes a civic task. That means land endowments, grain distributions, priestly schedules, and storage rooms full of offerings. Eternity is a spiritual goal, but it runs on logistics like everything else. Joke number 1, gentle. The ancient world invents immortality, and immediately it comes with a maintenance plan. Somewhere there is a priest thinking, if we miss Tuesday's offering, the cosmos is going to send a complaint. You can almost hear the divine customer service line ringing. Most historians agree that Egyptian kingship in the Old Kingdom carries a sacred dimension. The king is not just a ruler, he is a key figure in the relationship between humans and the divine. Archaeology suggests that monumental building reinforces this status, turning belief into something you can point at and say there, that is the order of the world made visible. The evidence we do have points to a worldview where building big is a religious act and a political act at the same time. Historians still argue whether the primary motive behind the pyramids is more about religious devotion, political power, or a careful blend of both. That debate is worth holding quietly in your mind because it keeps the story honest. A monument can be sincere and strategic. A king can believe in his own sacred role and also understand the advantage of looking unshakable. One interpretation is that religion and politics are not separate rooms in this world. They are one house, and the pyramid is the biggest piece of furniture in it. You look up at the pyramid's shape again, and the simplicity of it feels deliberate. A rising form, a clean geometry, a point that seems to aim at the sky. Most historians agree that Egyptian religion includes strong solar imagery and that the sun's daily journey and rebirth are central themes. The evidence we do have points to symbolic connections between the king and cosmic cycles. It's possible that the pyramid's form supports that symbolism, suggesting ascent rays or a path to the heavens. That is interpretation, not a locked answer, but it fits a broader pattern of Egyptian thinking about order and renewal. Now you let your imagination step into the king's inner world carefully and with disclaimers. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that royal mortuary practices exist, and that pyramid complexes include ritual architecture. The interpretation is how specific symbols map onto specific design choices. The imagined part is you for a moment feeling the weight of being the person everyone believes holds the universe together. If you ever felt stressed by an unread email, just imagine being told that if you fail, the sun might get confused. Joke number 2. Modern bosses say, "We need you to own this project." Old Kingdom Egypt says we need you to own the continued stability of reality. And you're like, can I at least get a day off? The cosmos does not offer paid time off. Archaeology suggests that the areas around pyramids include spaces for offerings and ritual activity supporting the idea of an ongoing cult. Most historians agree that these complexes are carefully planned to guide movement and ceremony. The evidence we do have points to a whole landscape designed for meaning, not just disposal of a body. And that brings you to a practical truth that can sound unromantic, but matters belief is easier to sustain when it is built into daily routines. One interpretation is that the pyramid project teaches people their place in a cosmic story. The king's monument rises, the temples receive offerings, the priests perform rites, the workers see stone turned into permanence. Everyone participates willingly or not in a narrative that says order exists and will continue. That is not a hidden secret. It is the visible strategy of a society trying to make the world feel stable. Now gently, you turn the spotlight toward the idea of something older beneath the surface, without claiming certainty. Most historians agree that Egyptian religion grows from earlier traditions in the Nile Valley, including pre-dynastic beliefs and local cults that evolve over time. Archaeology suggests continuity and change with older practices reshaped into state religion as the kingdom develops. One interpretation is that some symbols and rituals used in the Old Kingdom may have roots that predate the dynasties carried forward as habit and story. That is plausible, and it doesn't require a lost, advanced civilization. It requires humans doing what humans do, keeping what feels meaningful, adjusting it to new power structures, and forgetting where it originally came from. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what if the urge to build for eternity existed in simpler forms long before pyramids? Earlier communities bury their dead with care. They mark graves. They build communal spaces. They tell stories about the sky and the river and the people who came before. Over centuries, that urge could intensify, collect authority, and finally express itself as a state project, so large it turns belief into skyline. A fringe idea proposes that the pyramid is not mainly a tomb at all, but a kind of initiatory structure, a secret device for spiritual transformation used by select groups rather than built for the public story of kingship. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for a hidden initiation program embedded in the architecture is thin. Still, it persists because the interior passages feel mysterious, and because humans love the idea that the real purpose is always the one no one talks about. A more cautious explanation could be that the interior reflects practical constraints, design changes and ritual needs, without requiring a secret society to explain every corridor. Let me rephrase that. More carefully, curiosity about symbolism is reasonable, but turning every unknown into certainty can make the story less true, not more exciting, that's a possibility, not a certainty. You breathe slowly and let the plateau wind steady your thoughts. The pyramid remains silent, and silence makes room for questions. What's broadly accepted is that the king's afterlife mattered enormously, and that monuments supported that belief. The evidence we do have points to ritual architecture, ongoing offerings, and a worldview where order is sacred. Historians still argue whether the pyramid's symbolism is primarily solar stellar or a blend shaped by changing religious emphasis. That debate keeps the sky open. It also fits the way religions evolve. Belief is not a frozen object. It is a living practice. It adapts, absorbs, and sometimes rewrites itself while insisting it never changes. Humans are very good at that. Joke number 3. If you have ever updated your phone and then told yourself, it's basically the same, congratulations, you understand how traditions can change while pretending they did not. Only here the update is measured in centuries, and instead of new emojis, you get new theological emphasis. You picture the long chain again, but without claiming you can see every link. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the religious function of the complex. The interpretation is how deep the older roots run. The imagined part is the feeling of standing at night under a sky that looks like a ceiling of ancient signals and wondering if the builders felt they were not just stacking stone but stacking meaning. And now you let that thought settle into something calm. The true builders in the mainstream sense are people working under a king in a structured society. But one interpretation is that the deeper builders include generations of belief, older river and desert traditions and stories passed hand to hand until they become state religion. And what if just for a quiet moment the wind across the plateau is not only wind, but a reminder that humans have always tried to make something that outlasts them, even if all they can truly leave behind is stone ritual and a question that stays gentle in the dark. You wander toward the shape that feels less like architecture and more like a presence. Even at night, even half swallowed by shadow, the Sphinx has a way of making you lower your voice in your own head. The body stretches out like a lion at rest, massive and patient, and the face looks outward with that steady, unreadable calm that makes humans immediately start projecting their entire emotional life onto stone. Most historians agree that the Great Sphinx is part of the Old Kingdom landscape at Giza and that it connects to the royal world of the 4th dynasty. Archaeology suggests it was carved from the natural limestone bedrock and shaped in direct relationship to the plateau and its quarries. The evidence we do have points to a practical origin story at its core. Someone chose a ridge of limestone, cut away what wasn't needed, and turned the remaining mass into a guardian form that could stare down centuries without blinking. You stand close enough in your imagination to feel the scale of the pores, the way they extend forward like the world's largest stone stretch. The surface is not smooth like a polished statue in a museum. It's weathered, patched and textured by time. You can almost smell the limestone dust that would rise when tools meet stone, a chalky scent that clings to skin and hair. One interpretation is that the Sphinx is both sculpture and landscape engineering, Carving it creates a monument, but it also rearranges the plateau, pulling stone from one place, leaving an iconic form in another. A careful reading might suggest the builders were not only shaping a symbol, they were managing terrain, quarry debris, and sacred space all at once. In other words, it's art and it's construction planning, and it's a very strong suggestion that someone had a vision and a lot of labour. Joke number 1, gentle. The Sphinx is basically the ancient version of carving a pumpkin, except your pumpkin is a limestone ridge the size of a building, and the knife is a workforce, and the deadline is eternity. No pressure. Most historians agree that the Sphinx has been repaired multiple times across history. Archaeology suggests restoration blocks were added in different eras, and the evidence we do have points to ongoing maintenance because limestone does not enjoy being sandblasted for thousands of years. Wind, sand, temperature, shifts, salt and moisture can all wear stone down. That's not mysterious. That's geology doing its slow, relentless hobby. You imagine a repair crew in a later period. Different clothing, different language, same basic job. Clear away sand, assess damage, patch where the stone has weakened, replace blocks, try to make the face look dignified again. The Sphinx becomes a monument that gets treated like an elder in the community. Not dead, not finished, but cared for, argued over and brought back when time tries to erase it. Historians still argue whether the original face was intended to resemble a specific king, or whether later reworking changed its features enough that certainty is difficult. That one sentence alone tells you how tricky ancient attribution can be. Even if you have a strong mainstream leaning, the lines are not always crisp. Some researchers favour an association with Khafra because the Sphinx sits near Khafra's complex and seems to fit the broader plan of the area. A more cautious explanation could be that proximity and symbolism matter, but they don't always equal a signature. The evidence we do have points to the Old Kingdom context, and within that there is room for debate about precise commissioning. Now you focus on the famous question that keeps people awake in the wrong way, so we'll handle it in a sleepy way. The weathering patterns on the Sphinx have sparked arguments for decades. Some observers note that certain erosion features look rounded or vertically grooved in ways they associate with heavy water exposure. Others argue the patterns can be explained by wind, sand salt, crystallization, and groundwater, especially given the geology of the limestone layers. The evidence we do have points to a complicated interaction of factors rather than one clean cause. One interpretation is that the Sphinx's body, carved from layered limestone, weathers unevenly because different layers erode differently. A careful reading might suggest the stone itself is telling you about its weaknesses, not necessarily about a dramatically different climate era. This is suggestive, not conclusive, but it leans toward the idea that you can get surprising erosion patterns without needing a radically older date. And yet the misty part arrives right on schedule. A fringe idea proposes that the Sphinx is far older than the Old Kingdom, perhaps dating back to a time when the climate was wetter, which would imply a long-forgotten chapter of human activity on the plateau. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the evidence for a dramatically earlier date is thin and heavily debated. Still, it persists because it offers a thrilling possibility. It hints at a civilization that existed before dynastic Egypt, one that carved a guardian long before pyramids rose nearby. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can ask a calmer version of the question. What if the Sphinx sits on a site that had meaning even before the grand monuments? What if earlier communities visited this ridge, used it as a landmark, told stories about it, or marked it in ways that did not survive? That is a possibility, not a certainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the Sphinx is ancient, carved from bedrock and repaired repeatedly. The interpretation is the exact commissioning and the precise mix of erosion causes. The imagined part is the feeling of standing here on a quiet night, watching the Sphinx watch you back, and letting the unanswered edges stay unanswered. Joke number 2, the Sphinx is also the original customer support desk. You bring your questions, it stares silently, and you leave with even more questions. No ticket number, no email, follow-up, just vibes. You picture sand piling up over centuries, burying the body again and again, then being cleared again and again. That cycle alone can make the Sphinx feel like it belongs to more than one era, because it does. It's a monument that keeps re-entering the world. When it's buried, it becomes legend. When it's uncovered, it becomes an argument. When it's repaired, it becomes a responsibility. Most historians agree that later Egyptian rulers showed interest in restoring older monuments, and archaeology suggests the Sphinx was an object of reverence and attention in multiple periods. The evidence we do have points to a long afterlife for this guardian, where each generation meets it differently. Some see it as a sacred protector, some see it as an impressive relic, some see it as a problem to fix, some see it as a mystery to solve. Humans are very consistent in that way too. One interpretation is that repair itself changes what you think you are looking at. If a face has been recut or a body has been patched later, viewers may mistake restoration for original design. A careful reading might suggest that the Sphinx is not a single moment frozen in time. It's a layered object, like a building renovated across centuries. That does not make it less authentic. It makes it more human. Now, the civilization before Egypt theme returns in a cautious, mainstream, friendly way. Most historians agree that the Nile Valley had people and communities long before dynastic Egypt, and archaeology suggests pre-dynastic cultures developed complex practices over time. One interpretation is that places like Giza could have held significance as landmarks or ritual spaces even before monumental stone carving became state policy. The evidence is thinner here, so if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Joke number 3, a monument is important when it gets restored by multiple regimes. It's like the ancient world's version of a historic building getting renovated, except the renovation budget is still paid in bread, and the project manager is the desert. You let your breath slow. The Sphinx stays still. The night wind keeps brushing across the plateau like a soft broom, and you realise the real power of this guardian is not that it answers anything, it's that it holds the questions without collapsing under them. What's broadly accepted is that the Sphinx belongs to the Old Kingdom setting, and that it has been shaped and reshaped by time and humans. One interpretation is that its weathering and repairs create a puzzle that invites debate without demanding a single conclusion. And what if, just as a calm piece of imagination, the Sphinx is doing exactly what it was meant to do? Not giving you a secret, but keeping watch over the boundary between what we can document and what we can only wonder about gently under the stars. You step away from the Sphinx's heavy silence and let your attention slide into a different kind of mystery, the kind that lives inside stone corridors where sound changes and air feels cooler. You do not need to claim secret powers to feel that. Anyone who has walked into a narrow passage knows the body reacts. Your shoulders tighten slightly. Your breath becomes louder. The world feels closer. Most historians agree that the Great Pyramid contains internal chambers and passages that reflect both practical engineering and ritual purpose. Archaeology suggests these spaces were planned, modified, and executed with careful stonework, especially where granite is used. The evidence we do have points to a design that is not random, even when it surprises you. You imagine yourself entering a passage where the ceiling lowers. The air is dry, but it carries a faint mineral smell, the scent of stone that has been closed off for ages. Your footsteps would sound small here, like you are visiting someone else's house and trying not to wake them. The corridor angles and you feel the slope in your legs. This is not an easy stroll. This is architecture that expects effort. One interpretation is that the interior is a record of decisions. A careful reading might suggest that plans changed during construction, that engineers adapted, that priorities shifted. The presence of multiple chambers and the complex layout can be seen as evidence of a project in motion. It's possible that some choices were made in response to structural concerns, timing, or evolving ritual ideas, rather than being locked in from the first day. Historians still argue whether the Great Pyramid's interior design reflects a single coherent master plan or a series of adjustments made as the building progressed. That debate is important because it keeps you from treating the pyramid like a perfect, unchanging blueprint. Humans build by revising. Even when the goal is eternity, the process is messy. The evidence we do have points to skill, but skill does not mean perfection in planning. It means the ability to respond. You picture the granite elements and you feel the weight of them in your mind. Granite is not local to Giza in the way limestone is. It has to be brought, shaped and placed with care. Most historians agree that granite appears in key interior components, like the sarcophagus and certain chamber features. Archaeology suggests a deliberate choice, and the evidence we do have points to a hierarchy of materials. You use the hardest, most difficult stone where permanence and symbolism matter most. Joke number one gentle: if you have ever paid extra for the premium version of something because it feels more serious, congratulations, you share a mental habit with the Old Kingdom. Only here, the premium upgrade is a granite box that weighs more than your entire apartment. Now your attention goes to the narrow shafts and odd angles that fascinate people. Some shafts connect to chambers and head outward. Some spaces are so tight they seem almost designed to confuse modern minds. A popular rumour claims these features are ventilation systems, escape routes, or secret channels for spiritual energy. Most historians agree that some features could help with airflow during construction or serve symbolic roles, but the exact purpose of every shaft is debated. The evidence we do have points to possibilities rather than certainty. One interpretation is that certain shafts had ritual meaning, possibly connected to the king's soul, the stars, or the idea of a path beyond. A careful reading might suggest that even practical design elements can carry symbolic weight in a culture where architecture is never just architecture. It's possible the builders created passages that were both functional and meaningful, because why waste an opportunity to attach a cosmic story to a stone corridor? Joke number 2. Modern buildings hide their wires behind walls. Ancient buildings hide their mysteries behind walls. Same impulse, different content. Now the discussion shifts into a new kind of what if that stays careful. A fringe idea proposes that the interior chambers were designed for purposes beyond burial, perhaps as an initiation space, an observatory, or a device of some unknown kind. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for non-funerary primary use is thin compared to mainstream interpretations. Still, it lingers, because the interior feels strange, and humans love to assume strange means secret. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Feeling strange is not evidence, it is a mood. It is a clue for curiosity, not a conclusion. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, we can ask, could some interior choices reflect ritual experiences for priests or officials? Could certain routes have been used for ceremonies? Could the design shape sound light and movement in ways that supported belief? These are questions you can hold gently. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that chambers and passages exist and were built with impressive stonework. The interpretation is what each feature was for and how much the plan evolved. The imagined part is you standing in a dark corridor, hearing your own breath and wondering whether the builders intended the space to feel like a threshold. You begin to imagine the work of building the interior. It's easy to focus on stacking blocks outside, but carving and placing internal spaces has its own challenges. You must keep loads distributed. You must prevent collapse. You must plan for voids inside a mountain of stone. Most historians agree that structural understanding was crucial. Archaeology suggests that features like relieving spaces and careful stone placement protected key chambers. The evidence we do have points to engineering knowledge that is practical and earned. Historians still argue whether the builders fully understood the long-term stress behaviour of massive stone structures, or whether they succeeded through tested rules and cautious overbuilding. That debate is another reminder that ancient engineers did not need modern math notation to be competent. One interpretation is that they relied on experience pattern recognition and conservative choices. If you are not sure, you make it thicker. If you are worried, you add weight distribution. If you are anxious, you build like you do not want your boss to yell at you in the afterlife, which is a very strong motivator. Joke number 3. Nothing says cautious engineering like building a stone roof system designed to survive the next 4,000 years. Your home improvement project cannot even survive one rainy season without leaking. But okay, sure, you are the problem. Now your thoughts drift toward the idea of a pre-Egypt template without making it a claim. Most historians agree that building practices evolve. Archaeology suggests earlier tomb forms and construction methods existed before the biggest pyramids, and the evidence we do have points to experimentation over generations. One interpretation is that the Great Pyramid's interior reflects lessons learned from earlier structures, refined into something more ambitious. It's possible there were designs that worked, designs that failed, and designs that taught builders what not to do. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, what if the civilization before Egypt idea is really pointing to the long apprenticeship of Egyptian building itself? Earlier communities build simpler tombs, then step structures, then more complex forms. Methods accumulate, plans become bolder, and by the time the Great Pyramid rises, the interior is not a mystery device. It is the mature expression of a tradition that has been practicing for a long time. A popular rumour claims there are still hidden chambers that would rewrite everything. This theory isn't widely accepted as a guarantee, but it stays alive because large stone structures can contain voids and unknown spaces, and because discovery stories are addictive. A more cautious explanation could be that complex monuments sometimes have unexplored pockets or structural gaps, and learning more would refine details without necessarily overturning the mainstream picture. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, especially when stone hides space. You step back out into the night, in your mind, letting the open sky return. The interior feels like a quiet stomach of stone, holding choices and meanings close. Most historians agree it fits within a funerary and royal context. One interpretation is that it also shapes experience, guiding movement, sound, and imagination. And what if the interior's strangeness is not a clue to secret technology, but a clue to how seriously humans take the boundary between life and death, turning architecture into a slow stone way of saying, here is a path you cannot fully see, but you can feel. You let the plateau quiet, widen in your chest until you can almost hear the world beyond Giza, because Giza is not a bubble. Even if the stones feel eternal, the people who planned and fed this place live in a network of roads, rivers, and routes that pull ideas in and push goods out. The night wind keeps brushing across the rock, and it feels like a reminder that air travels, stories travel, and so do materials that do not naturally grow or form here. Most historians agree that Old Kingdom Egypt was not isolated, and that trade and contact connected the Nile Valley to neighbouring regions. Archaeology suggests imported materials and exchanged goods moved along routes to the Levant, the Sinai, Nubia, and beyond. The evidence we do have points to a simple truth: big projects tend to create big appetites. You need copper, you need stone, you need wood, you need fibres, you need skills. And when something is scarce, locally, humans do what humans always do. They go looking. You imagine a caravan leaving the green edge of the Nile and heading toward the dry spaces where copper and turquoise can be found. The sun would be harsh by day, but tonight you keep it calm, imagining the softer side of travel. Footsteps on packed earth, donkeys shifting their loads, the dry smell of leather rope and dust. Somebody is always thirsty, somebody is always complaining, somebody is always saying we should have left earlier, which is true in every century. Joke number one, gentle. The first international trade agreement is probably just two tired people staring at each other and saying, I have copper, you have grain. Neither of us wants to carry this any farther, please help. Archaeology suggests copper played an important role in tool making. And most historians agree Egypt acquired resources through a mix of local extraction expeditions and trade. The evidence we do have points to organisational reach. A state that can send people to quarry stone can also send people to secure minerals and materials. That matters because it changes how you picture the pyramid. It is not only local labour at a local site, it is also distant labour, feeding the tool supply, the rope supply, the wood supply, the whole background inventory that keeps the visible work moving. One interpretation is that the real miracle of Giza is not just engineering, but coordination across landscapes. A careful reading might suggest that Egyptian leaders and administrators treat the wider region like an extension of their workshop. They pull in what they need, they negotiate or compel access, they manage risks, and they convert distant resources into local stonework. Most historians agree that timber was valuable in Egypt, where large straight trees were limited compared to some neighbouring areas. Archaeology suggests imported wood appears in certain contexts, and the evidence we do have points to exchange networks that could bring in better building materials for boats, sledges, scaffolding, and other necessities. Wood is the silent helper in stone construction. It does not survive as dramatically as stone, so it gets less attention. But without wood, a lot of ancient technology becomes harder to imagine. You picture a workshop receiving timber not as a grand ceremony, but as relief. Someone inspects the grain. Someone tests a beam. Someone nods. Good wood means fewer broken parts. Fewer broken parts means fewer injuries and fewer delays. In a world without spare parts, Store's good wood is basically a luxury item and a safety plan. Historians still argue whether the most important external influences on Old Kingdom Egypt were primarily material like resources and goods, or also included significant transfers of ideas and techniques. That debate sits right in the sweet spot of what can be asked without forcing an answer. It is broadly accepted that goods moved. Ideas often move with goods, but proving the exact path of an idea is harder than proving the path of a jar or mineral. One interpretation is that contact creates a shared toolbox of habits. People watch each other, they borrow what works, they adapt, they forget who invented it first. And the evidence we do have points to a region where communities are not sealed off from each other, even when they see themselves as separate. You let your mind wander into the human experience of exchange. A boat arrives with goods. A messenger arrives with news. A traveller arrives with stories. Some of those stories are true. Some are exaggerated. Some are meant to impress. Some are meant to warn. You can almost hear the gossip in a work camp, the way someone says, "I heard in the north they build differently," and someone else says, "Sure you did." And then everyone argues until the bread shows up. Joke number 2, the first viral rumour is probably also about construction. A guy in the next region can move a block with half the people, and then you try it and it does not work, and everyone pretends they never believed it. Most historians agree that Egypt also interacted with Nubia to the south, and archaeology suggests there were exchanges of goods, and at times conflicts and expeditions. The evidence we do have points to a frontier that is not a simple line, but a zone where people meet, trade and compete. This matters for a bedtime question, because it reminds you that a civilization is not only what it builds, but how it connects. Even a pyramid, as fixed as it looks, is the end point of moving relationships. One interpretation is that the civilization that existed before Egypt might not be a single lost empire at all. It's possible that what came before is a patchwork of older communities across a wide region, each contributing small pieces to the habits that later become Egyptian in the grand official sense. That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it fits the way cultures form. They form by merging, borrowing and absorbing. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is contact and trade across regions. The interpretation is how much technique and symbolism travelled along those routes. The imagined part is a quiet night conversation between two workers, one from the Nile Valley and one from farther away, sharing a small trick about rope twisting or measuring angles, not because they are rewriting history, but because they want tomorrow to be slightly less miserable. Now carefully you touch the fringe in a safe way. A fringe idea proposes that an earlier sophisticated culture once linked multiple regions, and that later societies inherited its practices without remembering its name. This theory isn't widely accepted and hard evidence for a single vanished civilization teaching everyone is thin. Still, it can be treated as a mood of possibility rather than a conclusion. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can ask a gentler question: could some shared habits across the ancient world reflect deep time continuity, where similar problems produce similar solutions, and occasional connections spread the best ideas farther than we can trace? A more cautious explanation could be that humans are excellent at converging on workable methods. If you need to move heavy things, you discover levers. If you need to measure straightness, you invent lines. If you need to coordinate labour, you invent roles. Similar needs can create similar tools without a single hidden teacher. The evidence we do have points to both things being true at once. People invent locally, and people borrow when they can. You picture the objects that move between regions because objects are proof of connection. A bead, a jar, a tool shape, a timber beam, a mineral chunk. Each one is a quiet messenger that says, someone travelled, someone exchanged someone, valued what was not made at home. Joke number 3, you know trade is real when someone is willing to haul something heavy across a desert. If it is not valuable, nobody is doing that. Humans are lazy in a very consistent, scientifically observable way. Most historians agree that Giza rises from an Egyptian context driven by Egyptian kingship and belief. Archaeology suggests the project is rooted in local labour, local administration, and local tradition. One interpretation is that outside contact does not diminish that. It enriches it. It provides materials and occasional ideas that a skilled society can absorb. And what if, in the calmest cinematic sense, the plateau is like a meeting point where the Nile's internal traditions stand tall while the wider world quietly supplies threads of material and influence that get woven into the final fabric. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We can see trade in objects. We can see contact in roots. We cannot always see the exact moment an idea crosses a border. But you can stand here in the night air and feel how unlikely it would be for a civilization to build something so massive without reaching outward at least a little, the way a hand reaches for tools on a shelf. Not to claim a secret, but to acknowledge a network older than monuments, humming quietly beneath the stone. You let your gaze slide away from the heavy certainty of stone and into the lighter, stranger territory of human storytelling, because monuments do not only attract workers and priests, they attract theories, they attract rumours, they attract the kind of late night conversation where someone says quietly, "Okay, but what if it's deeper than that?" And everyone leans in, even if they are pretending they are too cool to care. Most historians agree that the pyramids at Giza were built in Egypt's Old Kingdom within a clear archaeological and cultural context. Archaeology suggests the site fits into a broader pattern of Egyptian royal architecture, administration, labour organisation, and religious practice. The evidence we do have points to human planning and human persistence, not supernatural shortcuts. That is the solid ground. And still, humans have always loved a second story, running under the first one like a secret river under a city street. One interpretation is that when a monument is too impressive for everyday imagination, people start inventing explanations that match the scale of their feeling. Not the scale of the evidence, the scale of the feeling. That is how legends begin. That is how fringe ideas stay alive, even when the mainstream picture is already astonishing. You can almost feel the shift in the air when you enter this territory. The night wind does not change, but your attention changes. You start noticing how easily your mind wants a single hidden key, a lost continent, a vanished teacher civilization, a dramatic reset of history that makes you feel like you discovered something everyone else missed. It is a very human temptation, and it does not make you bad. It just means you are awake looking at something big and trying to match it with a story that feels big enough. A fringe idea proposes that Giza, or parts of its knowledge base, came from an advanced prehistoric civilization often linked in popular imagination to Atlantis. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for Atlantis as a historical source for Old Kingdom construction is thin. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. Still, it can be useful to understand why these ideas show up and what they might be reacting to. Joke number 1, Gentle Atlantis, is basically the ancient world's missing sock drawer. If something is hard to explain, people say it must have fallen into Atlantis, and then they move on with their day. What's broadly accepted is that Plato tells the famous Atlantis story in dialogues written long after the Old Kingdom, and most historians treat it as a philosophical narrative, possibly inspired by real events or places, but not a direct historical record of pyramid building. That is the mainstream anchor. The evidence we do have points to Atlantis being a story with symbolic purpose, not a construction manual for Giza. So why does the Atlantis idea cling to pyramids like sand clings to your shoes? One interpretation is that it offers a neat answer for questions that remain open. How did they align so well? How did they coordinate so many tasks? How did they achieve such scale? A popular rumour claims the answers require lost advanced technology, and that this technology must have belonged to a civilization older than Egypt. This rumour is not widely accepted as a factual account, but it is common as a modern narrative. A more cautious explanation could be that the questions feel bigger than the answers because the answers are often boring in the best way. Organisation, food, tools, training, time. Those are not dramatic. They are just powerful. People often underestimate what humans can do with simple methods repeated well. Historians still argue whether the popularity of lost civilization theories comes mainly from genuine gaps in evidence or from modern storytelling habits that prefer dramatic revelations. That debate is not about stones. It is about minds. It is about how you right now react to uncertainty. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And uncertainty is a magnet for imagination. You start to notice patterns in the fringe stories. Many of them use the same moves. They point to real mysteries, like uncertainties about specific methods. Then they jump to a very large conclusion. They treat we do not know every detail as therefore the whole thing must be rewritten. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not knowing every detail does not automatically mean the mainstream is wrong. It often means the past is complex and evidence is incomplete. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Egypt built Giza in the Old Kingdom and left a material and cultural context. The interpretation is how certain techniques worked in detail and what certain features meant symbolically. The imagined part is the mood of standing here at night and letting your mind ask, what if there was an older chapter? Now you look at another common shape of fringe, thinking the map shaped kind. A popular rumour claims the pyramids sit at a special global location, or that their latitude encodes a number that feels meaningful, or that their placement connects to some worldwide grid of ancient power sites. This theory isn't widely accepted as evidence of a hidden global civilization. A more cautious explanation could be that humans are extremely good at finding patterns after the fact, especially when they already want the pattern to exist. Joke number 2, give a human a world map and enough free time and they will connect points with lines until the map looks like a conspiracy-themed spiderweb. Then they will call it research and ask you to be impressed. Most historians agree that ancient builders made choices based on local geography, religious meaning, political visibility, and practical access to materials. Archaeology suggests Giza's placement makes sense within Egypt's landscape close to the Nile's resources, but on stable, high ground. The evidence we do have points to reasons that do not require a global grid. It's possible that later observers, especially in modern times, add extra layers of meaning because the monument feels like it deserves them. One interpretation is that lost civilization theories sometimes act like a compliment. They say, "This is too good to be ordinary." But ordinary humans, organised well, are not actually ordinary in what they can do. They are capable of projects that outlive their own languages. Now you let your mind touch the catastrophe, reset version still carefully framed. A fringe idea proposes that a global disaster wiped out an earlier advanced culture, leaving only fragments of knowledge that later societies inherited. This theory isn't widely accepted, and direct evidence tying such a scenario to Giza's construction is thin. Still, the idea has emotional power. It explains why you would see skill without seeing the full earlier civilization. It explains why the teachers are missing. It is a tidy narrative for messy evidence. A more cautious explanation could be that knowledge can be lost in smaller, quieter ways. A workshop tradition can fade. A craft lineage can break. A river can shift and bury a settlement. Records can decay. You do not need a worldwide catastrophe to lose information. Sometimes you just need time and damp storage conditions. Joke number 3. History is the only subject where you can lose the instruction manual and still be expected to build the furniture. And then thousands of years later, people argue about whether you use the right screwdriver. To keep the solid ground clear, most historians agree the development of Egyptian monumental architecture shows a progression across generations, with earlier forms and experiments leading to later achievements. Archaeology suggests continuity in tools, organisation, and religious practice. The evidence we do have points to evolution, not a sudden import of impossible knowledge. So what do you do with the mist, without letting it become fog that hides everything? You hold it like a bedtime thought. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can ask, what if there were older traditions of measurement, stonework, and social coordination in the wider region that fed into Egypt's growth? That is a calm possibility. It does not require Atlantis. It does not require a vanished super-civilization. It simply allows that the human past is deeper than the labels we use. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And tonight, you do not have to choose between wonder and caution. You can let the mainstream story stay in front, steady and supported. And you can let the fringe stories exist as mirrors of human longing, reminders that when we face something enormous, we sometimes invent something even more enormous to match our awe. You let the night air feel a little less like desert and a little more like a question about time. The plateau is dry now, and it has been dry for so long that your brain wants to treat dryness as the default setting of the world. But the Earth has seasons that last centuries, and climates that turn slowly like a heavy door that does not slam. It just keeps swinging until one day you notice you are in a different room. Most historians agree that North Africa's climate has changed dramatically over long stretches of time, and archaeology suggests the Sahara was not always the endless dry expanse you picture today. The evidence we do have points to periods when the region was greener and wetter, with lakes, rivers and grasslands supporting human life in places that now look impossible. One interpretation is that these shifts shaped where people lived, how they moved, and what knowledge they carried with them. And what if the before Egypt feeling is less about a vanished super civilization and more about memories of a greener world that faded as the sands returned? You imagine it softly like a bedtime scene that does not need to be proven to be soothing, not tropical jungle, not fantasy, just a Sahara that has patches of green, seasonal water and herds moving across open land. You can almost smell wet earth after rain, a scent that would feel like a miracle in the desert today. You hear insects, distant birds, the low murmur of people near water. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that climates shift and the Sahara has had wetter phases. The interpretation is how those phases influence later societies along the Nile. The imagined part is you standing in grass that no longer exists, watching clouds gather where there is now only sky and sand. Most historians agree that the Nile Valley became a reliable corridor of life, a green ribbon in a region that could swing between wet and dry. Archaeology suggests that when conditions changed, people often clustered closer to stable water sources. The evidence we do have points to a reasonable possibility, as the Sahara-dried communities could have migrated toward the Nile, bringing with them skill stories and habits learned in different landscapes. One interpretation is that the Nile became not just a river, but a collector of people. You let that interpretation settle into something practical. People who live near shifting waters learn to plan. People who hunt and herd across wide spaces learn routes, seasons, and group coordination. People who build near lakes and river edges learn how to manage mud reeds, woodstone, and time. None of that requires an advanced, lost empire. It requires humans being adaptable, which is one of their most consistent talents. Joke number one, gentle. You think your neighbourhood changes when a new coffee shop opens. Imagine your neighbourhood changing because the entire climate decides to remodel the continent. Suddenly your moving boxes feel very small and very personal. Archaeology suggests that pre-dynastic communities in the Nile region developed increasingly complex social structures over time, and most historians agree that Egypt's state formation was gradual. The evidence we do have points to settlement, growth specialization, and evolving leadership. One interpretation is that environmental pressure can speed up organization. When resources are predictable, people can spread out. When resources tighten, people pack together, negotiate rules, and invent bigger systems. It's possible that drying conditions nudged communities into closer contact and increased the need for coordination, storage, and governance. Historians still argue whether climate change was the primary driver of early Egyptian state formation or just one important factor among many. That debate matters because it keeps the story honest. Climate can shape options, but humans still make choices inside those options. A careful reading might suggest a mix of forces: environment, trade belief, conflict, cooperation, leadership, and plain luck. The evidence we do have points to complexity rather than a single lever that explains everything. You let yourself picture the Nile Valley as a place where newcomers arrive. Not as strangers in a dramatic movie scene, but as families, small groups, people looking for stable water and farmland. They bring different crafts, different styles of building, different ways of measuring time, different stories about the sky. Over generations, those differences blend. Some survive, some fade. Some become the way things have always been, even though they are actually borrowed and adapted. One interpretation is that cultural memory can outlast names. A technique can persist even when nobody remembers where it came from. A knot in a rope can be taught without a story attached. A method of levelling ground can be passed down as habit, not as history. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, you can imagine that some of the practical knowledge used later in monumental building had older roots in communities whose homes were not made of stone and whose traces did not survive as cleanly. Joke number 2, humans will forget the name of the person who invented a helpful trick, but they will never forget the trick. That is basically how your family's cooking works too. Nobody knows who started putting that spice in the soup, but if you remove it, people will act like you committed a crime. Most historians agree that the Sahara's shifts include periods of lakes and waterways that later vanished. Archaeology suggests rock art and ancient settlement traces in now barren zones, pointing to human presence during wetter times. The evidence we do have points to a deep timeline of adaptation. One interpretation is that people who once lived in the wider green Sahara carried a big landscape perspective, a sense of distance, and route planning into later life near the Nile. It's possible that this wide horizon thinking helped societies coordinate across regions even before kings and bureaucracies formalized it. Now the misty part arrives carefully labelled and kept calm. A popular rumour claims that the Giza plateau itself once stood near a large body of water in a way that dramatically changes how you imagine the site, almost like a lost waterfront. This rumour is not widely accepted as a settled fact, and the evidence for a grand ancient harbour landscape, exactly as some tell it, is thin and debated. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient waterways, canals and floodplain edges changed over time, and that the relationship between the plateau and the Nile could have been different in subtle practical ways. Landscapes shift, rivers migrate, human channels fill in. That can create a sense of lost water without requiring an ocean where there was none. A fringe idea proposes that a long-forgotten pre-Egyptian culture thrived in a green Sahara, built significant centres, then vanished as the climate dried, leaving only fragments that later societies inherited. This theory isn't widely accepted in the dramatic form people sometimes present, especially when it implies advanced technology, still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, there is a softer version that fits the evidence more comfortably. Earlier cultures may have lived widely across North Africa during wetter periods, then relocated or transformed as conditions changed, carrying knowledge forward in modest human ways. Let me rephrase that more carefully. A mobile adapting network of communities is not the same thing as a single lost empire. That's a possibility, not a certainty, and it does not erase the mainstream story of Egypt's development. It simply adds depth to the background. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is climate change and human presence in places now dry. The interpretation is how much that movement shaped later Nile society. The imagined part is you standing at the edge of a vanished lake at dusk, watching people pack their lives onto simple boats or onto animals, deciding to follow water toward the river that will later define a civilization. Joke number 3, the oldest travel advice in history, is also the simplest. Follow the water. If you get lost, ask someone. If no one is there, you are probably in the Sahara at the wrong time. You feel the night wind on the plateau again, and it becomes a quiet metaphor. Sand moves, water moves, people move, stories move. Over centuries, the movement can smooth the edges of memory until the earlier chapters feel like legend. That is how a before can exist without leaving a neat label behind. Most historians agree that Egypt's rise is anchored in the Nile Valley, and its agricultural stability and archaeology suggest a gradual building of complexity. One interpretation is that climate shifts in the wider region could have helped funnel people and knowledge into the Nile corridor, thickening the cultural fabric that later supports monumental ambition. And what if, in the calmest sense, the true builders include not only those who lift stone at Giza, but also the long line of ordinary humans who followed the changing world, carried their skills on their backs, and left behind a greener Sahara that now lives mostly in traces and whispers beneath the sand. You slow your pace until the night feels like a classroom where the chalk is sand and the blackboard is sky. This is the moment when your mind wants a verdict, a single date stamped onto the stone like a label on a museum display. But stone does not come with a receipt. And even when humans try to make one, time has a way of smudging ink. Most historians agree that the pyramids at Giza belong to Egypt's Old Kingdom, especially the 4th dynasty, and that multiple kinds of evidence point in that direction. Archaeology suggests a web of clues. Inscriptions, quarry marks surrounding tombs, settlement remains, and the broader pattern of Egyptian royal building. The evidence we do have points to a strong mainstream timeline, even if not every detail is perfectly pinned down. You can feel the difference between a headline claim and the slower work behind it. A headline says, "This is when it happened." The slower work says, "Here is why we think that, and here are the parts that remain uncertain." That slower work is where credibility lives. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. You picture an archaeologist as a kind of patient sorter, not a treasure hunter in a movie. The archaeologist looks at layers, looks at context, looks at what sits above and below, looks at pottery styles, looks at tool traces, looks at inscriptions that name kings' officials, crews or places. Most historians agree that when many lines of evidence converge, the result becomes more reliable. It is not about one magic proof. It is about several imperfect clues agreeing often enough that the story holds. Joke number 1. Soft and sleepy. You want a simple date, but the past is basically a garage full of unlabeled boxes. You can still figure out what belongs to what, but you might have to open a lot of dusty lids first. One interpretation is that dating ancient monuments is less like reading a clock and more like building a case. A careful reading might suggest that certainty is not a single moment. It is a gradual tightening, like pulling a knot until it holds. Archaeology suggests that sites like Giza are dated through a combination of direct and indirect evidence. The evidence we do have points to strong anchors, but also to the reality that anchors can have slack. For example, inscriptions can be powerful, especially when they sit in meaningful context. Most historians agree that names and titles found in and around Old Kingdom monuments help place them in time. But historians still argue whether every inscription is original to the moment of construction, or whether some labels could reflect later activity repairs or reuse in certain cases. That debate does not erase the mainstream view. It simply reminds you that the past is busy and people revisit important places. Radiocarbon dating is another line of evidence often discussed in modern archaeology, especially for organic remains associated with building activity. Archaeology suggests that charcoal wood, plant fibres, and other organic materials can be tested to estimate age. The evidence we do have points to radiocarbon as useful but not flawless. Wood can be old when it is used. Charcoal can come from older material burned later. Materials can be moved by later disturbance. One interpretation is that radiocarbon dates can support a timeline while still leaving room for careful conversation about what exactly is being dated. Joke number 2. If you ever try to guess how old leftovers are by sniffing the container, you understand the vibe of scientific dating. You get a range, not a dramatic announcement, and you still have to be cautious. You also have the dating that comes from the surrounding world. Most historians agree that the cemeteries, tombs, and settlements near Giza fit an Old Kingdom environment. Archaeology suggests that pottery styles, burial customs, and administrative patterns around the site align with that period. The evidence we do have points to a cultural neighbourhood that matches the pyramid's proposed time, like finding a book on a shelf where every other book is from the same series. One interpretation is that context is sometimes more persuasive than any single artifact. A careful reading might suggest that even if one clue is messy, the whole pattern can still be clear. If you find 4th dynasty style activity all around the pyramid complex, then the simplest explanation is that the pyramid belongs to that same world. A more cautious explanation could be that later periods interacted with the site too, but interaction is not the same as original construction. Now you let your mind notice how humans argue about certainty. Scholars continue to debate because debate is how weak ideas get tested and strong ideas become stronger. When you hear disagreement, it does not automatically mean everything is unknown. It often means people are trying to be precise, trying to avoid pretending that a probabilistic conclusion is a guaranteed fact. Historians still argue whether the remaining uncertainties about construction methods and certain features should change how we interpret the timeline, or whether they simply reflect gaps in documentation. That one sentence is the heart of it. Uncertainty can mean a missing detail, not a missing era. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And the honest way to live with that is to keep asking careful questions. Now gently you touch the alternative timelines that float around in popular conversation. A popular rumour claims the pyramids are far older than the mainstream timeline, built by a civilization that existed long before dynastic Egypt. This rumour is not widely accepted as fact, and evidence for such a dramatic redating is thin compared with the mainstream archaeological context. Still, the rumour persists because it offers a thrilling story and because large stone structures invite people to imagine equally large secrets. A fringe idea proposes that conventional Egyptian chronology is wrong by thousands of years, and that monuments like Giza have been misassigned. This theory isn't widely accepted, and it often relies on selective evidence, or on treating uncertainty as permission to rewrite everything. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Alternative chronologies can raise interesting questions about how evidence is interpreted, but they do not automatically outweigh the broad convergence of mainstream data. That's a possibility, not a certainty. And if someone claims certainty on a fringe timeline, it is fair to ask what the evidence actually is. A more cautious explanation could be that the mainstream timeline is broadly right, while details continue to be refined. New excavations can adjust understandings of workforce organisation. New analyses can sharpen the chronology of nearby tombs. New surveys can reveal features that change how you interpret certain spaces. That kind of refinement is normal. It is not a scandal. It is the slow improvement of a picture. You also think about how modern expectations can mislead. People often want ancient history to come with an exact calendar date and a neat project timeline. But most historians agree ancient societies did not leave documentation in the way modern bureaucracies do. Archaeology suggests the record is uneven, with some periods and places leaving more text than others. The evidence we do have points to a challenge that feels almost poetic. The biggest stone structures can outlast the paper trail that would explain them. Joke number 3. If you have ever lost a receipt for something you definitely bought, you already understand why. The past sometimes makes you want to yell, "Where is the paperwork?" The desert shrugs and says, "It was here, then it wasn't." Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that multiple lines of evidence place Giza in the Old Kingdom context. The interpretation is how each line should be weighted when they do not align perfectly. The imagined part is you watching the process of certainty being built like a pyramid of its own, one block at a time. Each block a clue, each block set carefully because a rushed conclusion can collapse. And now you allow one calm cinematic. What if that stays honest? What if the deeper story is not that the pyramids belong to a different secret era, but that the earliest chapters of Nile life, the ones that shaped measurement, labour organisation and belief, remain partly hidden, simply because they were written in mud brick and daily routine, not in monuments? What if the before is not a dramatic lost empire, but a long prelude that archaeology can glimpse only in fragments? Most historians agree that history is built from evidence, and archaeology suggests evidence is always incomplete. The evidence we do have points to a strong foundation, and the remaining gaps are not an invitation to abandon that foundation. They are an invitation to keep the questions gentle and careful. You stand in the night air and you let the plateau be what it is, a place where certainty exists, but it is assembled, not declared, and where the mist is not an enemy, just a reminder that time keeps some rooms closed even when the doors are made of stone. You let the night soften even further, because this is where the story stops chasing answers and starts accepting the shape of the question. The plateau feels calmer now, not because it has become less mysterious, but because you have learned how to hold mystery without turning it into a claim. The wind keeps brushing across the stone like a steady fan, and the stars keep their slow, indifferent turning, as if to say you can wonder all you want, but you still need to sleep. Most historians agree that Giza is an old kingdom achievement built by a complex human society with strong organisation, skilled labour, and powerful beliefs. Archaeology suggests the pyramids fit within a broader Egyptian pattern of royal monuments evolving from earlier building experiments and supported by settlements, logistics, and administration. The evidence we do have points to people, not miracles, as the true builders in the documented sense. And yet the title you carry in your mind tonight has that extra phrase, the civilization that existed before Egypt. You can hold it without turning it into a sensational secret. One interpretation is that before Egypt means the long prelude, the quieter centuries of learning and adaptation that make Egypt possible. It's possible that the most important inheritance is not a hidden device or a lost empire, but the slow accumulation of practical knowledge and shared meaning. Historians still argue whether the early roots of Egyptian civilization should be framed mainly as internal development along the Nile, or as a blend shaped by migrations, contacts, and environmental pressures. That debate is a good place to rest your head because it is honest. It keeps the mainstream foundation and still leaves room for depth. The evidence we do have points to a strong Nile-centered story, but it also suggests people and ideas moved, climates changed, and networks existed. One interpretation is that the true builders of Giza include not only the visible workforce of the Old Kingdom, but also the invisible chain of ancestors whose small decisions made big decisions possible later. You think about the simplest objects because they have a way of making history feel real. A rope fibre twisted the right way. A measuring rod marked with consistent units. A loaf of bread passed into a hand at dawn. A copper tool repaired instead of discarded. A boat that does not leak. A ledger that tracks rations accurately enough that nobody panics. These are not glamorous, but archaeology suggests these kinds of things are the backbone of monumental work, and the evidence we do have points to a civilization that could do the boring basics extremely well. Joke number 1, soft and friendly. The Great Pyramid is impressive, but the real flex is probably that someone managed a supply system without a single spreadsheet. Imagine doing procurement for a monument with no email, no instant messaging, and no coffee machine. Somehow, they still got it done. Now you let your mind check the mist again, gently, responsibly. A fringe idea proposes that Giza was built by a vanished, advanced civilization older than Egypt, whose technology and knowledge were lost. This theory isn't widely accepted, and evidence for that kind of dramatic replacement of the mainstream story is thin. A popular rumour claims the pyramids are the leftover machines of that earlier world, but the evidence we do have points far more strongly to human tools, human organisation, and human tradition. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the safe version of the question becomes smaller and more believable. Could older, less visible communities have contributed techniques, stories, or social habits that later Egyptians refined and scaled up? A more cautious explanation could be that the lost part is not a lost civilization, but lost documentation. The pyramid can survive when papyrus does not. The plateau can survive when mud brick villages crumble. The monument can outlast the memory of the first person who figured out a better knot for hauling. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm, and what we can't confirm is often the daily life that would make the picture feel complete. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the Old Kingdom context and the practical systems that supported construction. The interpretation is how deep the roots of those systems go into earlier periods and wider networks. The imagined part is you standing at the edge of a vanished green Sahara lake, or beside an early Nile village granary, watching someone teach a child how to measure and how to count, never guessing that those habits will someday help raise a stone mountain. Joke number 2, it is oddly comforting to know that history's biggest projects often depend on the smallest competence. Somebody had to be good at tying rope. Somebody had to be good at not burning the bread. Somebody had to be good at counting. These are the unsung heroes of civilization, and they would be very annoyed to hear that aliens did their job for them. You let that settle, and you feel the night air in your lungs cool and quiet. The plateau becomes less of a riddle to solve and more of a place to sit with. Most historians agree that Egypt's story is deep and complex, and archaeology suggests that even our best reconstructions are incomplete. The evidence we do have points to strong conclusions, but also to a respectful humility about what we cannot see. Historians still argue whether certain puzzling features at Giza are best explained by practical engineering choices, symbolic design, or a combination that shifts across time. And that is fine. It is normal. The past is not a locked room with one key. It is a house with many doors, and some of them open only a crack. Now the 300-word wind-down begins, and you let your language slow soften and stretch the way your body does when it finally decides it might be safe to sleep. You stay here on the plateau in your imagination with the wind moving steadily across the stone, and you let the pyramids become less like a question and more like a quiet shape in the dark. You do not need to force them to confess anything. You do not need to win an argument. You simply notice what they do to your breathing, how they invite your mind to widen and then gently to settle. Most historians agree these monuments were built by human beings with tired hands and stubborn hearts, with bread in their bellies and sand in their shoes, with songs and jokes and complaints that vanished into air. Archaeology suggests their world was organized, practiced, and patient, and the evidence we do have points to a long chain of learning that reaches back into quieter centuries. One interpretation is that the true builders include everyone who ever measured a field, stored grain, steered a boat, tied a rope, shaped a stone, or watched the stars to understand the season. And what if just for this calm moment the civilization before Egypt is not a hidden empire, but a deep human prelude, a soft background chorus of ordinary lives that made extraordinary work possible? You let the stars blur slightly as your eyelids grow heavy. You let the wind become a steady hush like a fan in a dark room. The stone stays where it is. The questions stay gentle, and your body finally gets permission to stop carrying them.